Hi, in this video we are going to understand what is Spring Boot auto configuration. Now if you have any Spring Boot application, if you'll go to the beginning, like where the application actually start, and if you look into the Spring Boot application annotation, you will find this annotation is combination of many different annotations, and one of them is enable auto configuration. So what is auto configuration and how it is helping us with Spring Boot? Okay, so to understand how auto configuration work, what we are going to do is we are going to just take some simple example, and we are going to understand how auto configuration is configured, or how by default the auto configuration is working. Then we will try to implement some custom auto configuration logic to understand how we can implement the auto configuration to solve different kind of problems. Okay, so let's first understand what is Spring Boot auto configuration. For that, I have this application, that is the core application present here. This application, if I'll go to the pom.xml, it has few dependencies. It has a Spring Boot starter, it has Spring Boot starter web, and Spring Boot data JPA. So let's do one thing, let's comment these two out. Okay, we do not want Spring Boot starter data JPA, also we do not want Spring Boot starter web. Okay, so now what I will do is I will just, okay, I forgot to reload, I'll just reload this. Now if I'll go to core application, I will just start this application. Okay, now if you'll see, our application started, but it's just a normal Java program. There is nothing happening. It's just started our core application. This is not a web application, but we want to develop a web application or a web service. And to develop a web service, we need a web server for us, right? And we also need to integrate or set up the dispatcher servlet and servlet engine, everything we need to configure to make it a web application. But if you're using Spring Boot, what we can do instead is we'll just go, let's say we add this dependency. Okay, we just added Spring Boot starter web dependency into our class path, or basically into our pom.xml file. Now Spring Boot starter web is present in our class path. Now if I'll start the application again, you see our application started. Now we have a Tomcat web server, we have our servlet engine, now we have a web application context, and we have a port to access our application. So now this is a web application. So how this happens is, I mean, what happened here? Let's understand what happened here. When we added this dependency into our class path, Spring Boot starter web, Spring Boot understood that, okay, this is going to be web application, and if you are developing a web application, you need a web server, you need to have a port or a to access a URL to access your web application. So it kind of set up a default environment for us so that we can develop our web application. Okay, so this is what auto configuration is. It's basically automatically configuring few things for us so that we do not have to configure many things manually, and we will have a seamless development process. Okay, so that is what auto configuration is doing. Now let's take one more example. Let's say I want to use, I'll just stop this application, and let's say I want to use Spring Boot starter web. Okay, I'll just uncomment this one. Oh sorry, I want to use Spring Boot starter data JPA. Okay, what I'll do is I'll just load these changes again. Okay, our changes are loaded. Now what I'll do is I'll run this application again. Now see, the application failed to start. Now what happened? When we added one more dependency, that is our I'll just scroll this down. Yeah, when we added Spring Boot starter data JPA, Spring Boot understood that this application is meant to communicate with a database or a data source. So what Spring Boot is looking for is we should have the URL or the connection string to that data source, but we didn't provide the connection string. So the URL attribute, it is saying that URL attribute is missing. So that is one way. Or how we can start our application, we can use any embedded databases or the in-memory database like H2, HSQL and Apache Derby. All this thing we can integrate with our Spring Boot application. So we do not have anything, we do not have a dependency, or we do not have this in-memory databases present in our class path, nor we have this connection string or the URL present. So Spring Boot could not start the application. Again, how this happened is because of the Spring Boot auto configuration. When we start our application, it triggered the auto configuration logic because we have this annotation. I showed you in the beginning. We have in this, if you'll go look into the Spring Boot application annotation, behind you will find this enable auto configuration. So the auto configuration logic looked into the class path, and in class path it found that we have a Spring Data JPA present. That means if we have a data source, this is basically a data source dependency. If we have a data source dependency, that means we are developing an application so that it will communicate with a database. Okay, but we are not providing any database connection string or any connection URL. Neither we are providing any what is that, the embedded database. Nothing is present. So that is why it is not able to understand that though we are using a dependency, there is no data source present. So that is why it didn't start the application. So if you want to go little deep to understand how it is happening, if you see your project and if you'll go to your external library and if you scroll down, I'll just expand this little bit. Here if you see, we have Spring Boot auto configuration. Okay, if I'll expand this, we have this meta.inf folder, and if I'll open that, and there is a file spring.factories. If I'll open the spring.factories, now if you'll see here, we'll scroll little up, you'll find auto configure. Now if you'll see into the Spring Factories file, we have something called auto configure. This auto configure, we have a enable auto configuration property, and the enable auto configuration has values that are different classes. So if I will search for, let's say, data source, you see we have data source auto configuration here. Okay, now let's look into this data source auto configuration. So I'll go to this data source auto configuration. Here if you see, this is the data source auto configuration class, and here there is a data source URL property, Spring data source URL. So in this class, I will not go deep into like how this logic, how this is implemented. We will understand all those things when we will implement our custom data auto configuration logic. Okay, but if you see here, there is a data source auto configuration is triggering. There are two things here you have to understand. One is configuration and one is conditional. These are two important annotations that you have to know to understand Spring Boot auto configuration. The configuration annotation means this class is a source of bean definition. So there can be multiple beans present under this class. Okay, the conditional annotations means these beans or these registration, this configuration can be registered based on certain conditions. If those conditions match, then you load this beans or register these beans. If those conditions doesn't match, then you don't load these beans. Now if you see, when we didn't have the Spring Data JPA in our pom.xml file, we were able to start our Spring Boot application without any problem. That's because this conditional on class, there is a condition on these beans. Spring Boot was not loading these beans. So the configuration, though it has configuration annotation, it was not using those, it was not registering those beans, because there is a condition on class. If the data source class is present, then you use this. So if you do not have this Spring Data JPA in your class path, that means the data source class is not present in the class path. So Spring Boot does not, it doesn't use all these conditions or all this logic. But when we added Spring Boot starter data JPA, that means we added the data source class into our class path, and then the auto configuration logic is just triggered, the auto configuration trigger, and it tried to register these configuration. While registering this configuration, it realized, okay, the data source URL is missing. Also, we are not providing any embedded database. So that is why it failed to start our application. Okay, so that is what auto configuration is. Auto configuration basically means it scan your class path based on different dependencies present in your class path. Spring Boot try to configure different beans or register different beans based on certain condition. Okay, so this is what Spring Boot auto configuration is all about. Now we can also implement Spring Boot auto configuration on our own. Like, we can have a custom logic to implement Spring Boot auto configuration. So let's use Spring Boot auto configuration to solve some problem, and that way we will be able to understand how to implement Spring Boot auto configuration. So we have one scenario here, what we are going to implement. We have this core library. This library is gonna provide a solution for end user to securely connect to any database. Okay, we are not going to implement any proper logic or any module to connect to database, but just understand the problem statement here and how we can solve that using Spring Boot auto configuration. So this library, core library, is going to provide a way for user to communicate with any database in a secure way. Okay, now if the end user does not have its own data source, then the user can take advantage or use the default data source provided by this library. But if the user has their own data source, then this library is going to communicate with that data source, the user defined data source. So for that, first thing what we will do is we will go to this pom.xml. We do not need this Spring Data JPA and Spring Web. I'll just remove these two and I will reload the project. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create one package under this core package. The package will be component. Okay, so we created one component package and we are going to create one config package. Okay, so first thing, we need to provide a method for end user to set up the connection with any data source. Okay, so for that there can be different type of data source. So what we are going to do is we are going to create one interface and we are going to name it data source. Okay, and this is gonna be an interface. So I'll just create this. So we have data source interface, and to communicate with or to set up the connection, we are going to define one method, that is void setup connection. Okay, so using this method, user can communicate with any database. Either they can define their own data source and communicate with it, or if there is no data source defined, they can make use of the default data source what we are going to provide. So let's implement the default data source. I'll create a class. I'll say default data source. Okay, and this is default data source is gonna be a type of data source. Okay, so we implement data source and we are going to override this method. As I told, we are not going to write any logic. I'll just simply type system out println, and I'm going to say using default data source. Okay. Now our requirement is, if the user or the client, whoever is going to use this library, they do not have any data source, then by default they can use this default data source. Okay, so to implement this logic, we are going to make use of the way auto configuration work. We are going to use the same way to implement this solution. Okay, so let me create a class. I'll name it as data source config. So we have this data source config class. So here we are going to we are going to implement auto configuration. So as I mentioned before, that there are two main annotations that mainly used to achieve the Spring Boot auto configuration. One of them is configuration. So if I'll annotate this class with configuration, this means this class can have one or more bean definitions or beans present in this class. So let's say we define one bean. We'll say public data source. We'll define a bean of type data source, and we'll say setup data source. Okay, I will just change it to camel case, and we are going to simply return new default data source. Okay, so this is gonna be one bean. So now when Spring Boot will find during component scan, when it will see this configuration, it will read this as a source of bean definition and it will register this bean. But our requirement is this bean should only register if there is no user defined bean is present. That means if there is no bean of type data source already present, then you load this. But if user has his own data source bean, then we do not have to load this. So what we are going to do is, we are going to make use of conditional annotations. So there are many different type of conditional annotation provided by Spring Boot. They are like conditional on class, which means if I annotate, which I'm going to use here also, if a class is annotated with conditional on class, and we provide the class name, that means if that particular class is present in the class path, then only the configuration mechanism will work. If that class is not present, then the registration on bean will not happen. Then we have conditional on bean. So this condition is going to work if certain type of bean is already present. Then we have conditional on missing bean, which we are going to use now. That means if the bean the particular bean is not present in the class path or not registered already, then you load the bean. So similarly, we have a conditional property, conditional on resource. So you can read about different conditional, but I'm going to use two conditional annotation here. One is conditional on missing bean. So here our requirement is this bean should get loaded if the user does not define its own data source. Okay, so then we will load this default data source. So I'll just annotate this with conditional on missing bean. Okay, that means if a bean of type data source is missing, then load this bean. But if a bean of type data source is already present, do not load this bean. Okay, and then we want this configuration mechanism to work only if our library is present in the the data source is present in the class path. So we are going to mark it as conditional on class, and here we are going to provide data source dot class. So this means that if data source dot class is present in the class path, then you load these configurations and register these beans. While registering these beans, make sure if a type of data source, a bean of type data source is missing, then only load this, or else do not. Okay, so this is our condition. This is our main feature what we are going to implement. Now let's go to, okay, so now we have implemented this, but there are few steps we need to perform to use Spring Boot auto configuration. Okay, this is the logic whatever we have implemented, but Spring does not know like where this condition is present, that we write this condition on data source config, but Spring does not know that. Like when it will perform auto configuration, we had to tell Spring that okay, our auto configuration logic is present in data source config class. So how we can do that? If you remember, initially I told you that the auto configuration is present as a library here. Okay, Spring Boot auto configuration. If I'll expand this, see all the information about auto configuration are registered here in Spring Boot auto configuration file, or the spring.factories file. So there is this property enable auto configuration. Spring Boot always read for this property, that enable auto configuration, and whatever class is defined under enable auto configuration, they are considered for auto configuration. Okay, so what we are going to do the same, we are going to just copy this. Okay, before that we are going to create this structure. So for that I'll just copy this file name, then I will go here under my resource folder. I'm going to create a new directory and I will name it meta-inf. Okay, and under this meta-inf I'm going to create a new file and use the same file name spring.factories. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this property. Okay, I will use this property. Now Spring will read this property to enable auto configuration. So which class has our auto configuration logic? So this data source config has our auto configuration logic, like how we want our auto configuration to work. We define inside data source default data source we define that in data source config class. Okay, so we'll go to this data source config class, we will copy the reference. Okay, then we'll go to Spring Factories and here we'll just paste it. I didn't copy it. Copy the reference and here we'll just paste it. Okay, so this property means that when Spring Boot will start the auto configuration logic, Spring Boot is gonna look for this enable auto configuration, and it is going to see that the value is data source config. Then it will load this data source config. Here it will while loading this, there are certain conditions. It will check that whether this data source class is present in the class path, and whether this conditional on missing bean, whether this bean is missing. If these two condition met, then it will load the default data source, or else it will not. So what we are going to do now is, so now we told basically we configured our auto configuration for Spring Boot to read it, but this project is gonna be a Spring Boot starter project. So we have to use this library as a Spring Boot starter for Spring Boot auto configuration to work. So what I'm going to do is, I'll go to this pom.xml file. There are few naming convention we have to use to make our project a starter project. We are going to use this Spring Boot starter. I'll just copy this, and our project artifact ID should be our project name hyphen Spring Boot starter. Okay, and I'm going to use the same as the project name. Okay, so now this is our Spring Boot starter project. It's gonna be our Spring Boot starter project. In this starter project, whenever we will start the enable auto configuration, Spring will look into this meta.nf folder. Inside that, it will find the spring.factories, and inside spring.factories, it will find this enable auto configuration for data source config. So it will go to data source config and load these conditions based on load this beans based on these conditions. Okay, so now what we're going to do is, let's go to our pom.xml file and load this. Okay, now what next is, we are going to, so I'm just going to run it. So our build is successful for this project. Okay, so we closed everything here. Now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to mimic the client environment. So I already have a client project. Okay, so we have this client project. Let's go to pom.xml of this client project, and we are going to add our library as a dependency. Okay, so just say dependency and go to this core libraries pom.xml file, and I'm going to just copy this 3. So in the client library, I'll just paste it. So let's load the client pom. So everything looks fine. Okay, now let's see whatever we implemented is working or not. So we have this client library. Let's go to this client application. I'm going to make use of a command line runner. So I'll just implement command line runner, and I'm going to implement the run method. Okay, now what we want to do is, we are going to use public data source. So we are going to set up the connection. So I'm just mimicking like how a client will work, can use our library. So if I'll just do data source dot setup connection. Okay, so when you call data source dot setup connection, it can connect to, so now client didn't define any we didn't define any data source, so it should use the default data source. So let's run this. If you see, using default data source. Okay, now let's say client want to define their own data source. So I'll just mark it as component I just create a package of component, and this component package, let's say I'll define a data source. Let's say this is the dev data source. Something wrong with my keyboard, I'm sorry, but yeah, there's a new keyboard. I am just getting used to it. So this is dev data source. I'll just click on class, and this is gonna implement data source. Okay, now we can implement the method. Okay, and I'm just going to write using client data source. Okay, so we need to put this into the we are going to make use of this bean. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark this as a component. So now what is happening, the client application has their own data source bean here. Okay, they have defined their own data source, and that is going to be the dev data source. So basically they are going to write the connection logic, everything in the set of connection method. Okay, so now if I will run, it should not use the default data source, it should use the client defined data source. Now if I'll run this, you see now it is using the client data source. So that's how you can implement, like this is one simple problem that we solved using the Spring Boot auto configuration, but there can be different problems that take advantage. There can be many different problems that we can solve using the Spring Boot auto configuration. So I hope this is clear about what is Spring Boot auto configuration and how you can implement your custom logic using Spring Boot auto configuration. So few things to notice here. If I'll go to this data source config, this is how we implemented our logic. There are different type of conditional annotation provided by Spring Boot. We are making use of two annotations here. One is conditional on missing bean. That means if there is a bean of type data source is not present, then you register this bean, or else just skip it. Similarly, this entire configuration basically is a source of bean definition. There are different type of bean definitions, can be different bean definition present inside data source config. That is why you marked it as configuration. And there is a condition here that if the data source is present in the class path, then only you use this configuration mechanism here, or else skip it, skip the entire thing. Okay, and to register, to tell Spring Boot that we have our own auto configuration logic defined in this class, we had to write we had to tell Spring using this property. So there is enable auto configuration property, and we provide our class reference as a value to this property for Spring Boot to understand that okay, there is a custom auto configuration logic defined. Okay, and for that you have to create this meta-inf folder, and inside this you have to write the spring.factories. Okay, and also we used this project as a starter project. So to make your Spring Boot application as a starter, a Spring Boot starter, you have to have the artifact id core.spring.boot.starter. So your application name, and then this should be there in your application name. Okay, Spring Boot starter, and same we use for the application name. Okay, so that's it. That is how Spring Boot auto configuration actually work, and this is how you can implement Spring Boot auto configuration to solve different problems. Okay, I hope it is clear. If you have any doubts, you can ask me over the comment section. I'll try to clarify your doubts. For now, I think that's it for this video. In the next video we will start developing our web services, and we will learn different things while developing the developing the web service. Okay, so thank you, see you in the next one. Bye.